Um, I want to thank very much Gail Cook and Mac Buster, who are with us this evening, for tonight's sponsors. Yay! Yay for Gail and Mac. Thank you very much indeed. And just two little housekeeping notes before I hand the word to Alex. One is for the Zoomers. The chat is disabled during the talk. So if you make insightful comments during the talk, they will be lost in cyberspace. So wait till the Q&A to join in on the chat, please. And for those of you in the room, I've been meaning to do this for about 2 years, but finally getting around to it. Please remember to turn off your cell phone. Yay. All right, okay. Alexandra Lawrence, a legend in her own lifetime, doesn't need much introduction, so I'm going to pass it over the word to you straight away.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Simon. Thank you. Thank you, Gail and Max. And thank you, everyone, for coming tonight to talk about Dante. Okay. Yes. Whatever works. Can everyone hear me? Are we okay? Yes? Okay.
Okay, there we are.
Oh, I feel very on spot. Okay. Yes. The important thing is the slides. Look up here. Look up here. It's always wonderful to, well, now I can't see anyone, but it's wonderful to have so many people here to speak about Dante, a tiny little part of Dante, because of course my greatest problem with Dante is trying to pack way too many things into a 45-minute sort of section of time here. So we will try to keep ourselves to the task at hand, the topic at hand, which is Dante's Florence, or rather Dante's sort of life in Florence. I do want to say, and in fact, I forgot to tell Sara to ask her to put this on the chat, but perhaps she can, is that a couple of years ago, I don't know, it was deep in lockdown time, I did from my house, but for the British, when we were doing Wednesday lectures only online, a lecture on the Guelphs and Ghibellines. So really delving very deeply into the political situation at the time. We, of course, are going to talk about it, but we won't go into detail. So if you are interested on YouTube and the library of the British Institute talks, you can find that from, I believe it was 2021. So just throwing that out there. But Dante had a very complicated relationship with Florence. In fact, I did another talk for the British that is called Godi Fiorenza. That's all about his relationship with Florence. It was very love-hate. So Dante, I would love to start here with a quote from Paradiso. So this is the great comedy, which we'll talk about, of course, throughout our time together tonight. But Paradiso is the final moment in his journey. And it is the moment where he has gotten all the way to the very top. So he's in what we call the Empyrean. He is about to see the face of God. And it is this incredible moment where Dante looks out and he says, and I'll just read it here in the translation, I, who had come to the divine from the human, to the eternal from time, and from Florence to a people just and whole, with what amazement must I be filled? I mean, when you're in Paradiso and you're looking out, you're 5 seconds away from seeing the face of God. You're in the circle of the blessed. You're there. It's the highest. There are no more heights to go up, and you sort of say, I came from the lowest of the low, i.e. Florence, and here I am. So if this doesn't tell us, right, immediately a little bit about what Dante sort of thinks about his birth and spending his first years, but most importantly, of course, his exile, which is what we will speak about. So I sort of start off with this notion of Dante being a very proud Florentine. I mean, he never lets us forget this, of course, but he has this very difficult relationship with the city itself. I have to say, after 25 years here, I am not a Florentine, but I certainly have, a bit of that push-pull, but primarily because of my pride, right, for the city, much like Dante. Actually prior to the quote that I just read you, he speaks about Florence. Again, he talks about Florence a lot in the comedy, but he tells us when he was born. Now, I have to back up just a bit because this is the problem. Several years ago, and I don't know if you all do this, but several years ago, I presented a novel that a friend of mine had written. And she was here in Florence. It's set in Florence. So I was presenting it for her at a beautiful bookstore called Todo Modo here in Florence. And the entire time, it was a book written in the first person from a young woman's perspective, that the whole entire time I was reading, for me, it was my friend as she's telling this story. And the whole time that I'm doing this presentation, I kept referring to the main character as you when we were speaking to one another, because I couldn't sort of separate out, even though different names, she had named her character, her protagonist, something different. But our problem, in quotes here, with Dante and the comedy is that he tells us this story in the first person and he names his protagonist, his character, Dante. And so we have to constantly remind ourselves that we have two Dantes here talking to us. One is the poet and one is the pilgrim, Dante. So when I say he tells us, right, we get so much, or we think we get so many autobiographical details from Dante through the Divine Comedy because of this first person and naming his protagonist, Dante. So here he tells us, the sign, he was born, and the sign that follows Taurus, when I first felt the air of Tuscany. So he's reminding us, he's telling us rather, as he's up in Paradiso and he's looking down, he's kind of taking a moment to observe the little bit of Paradiso that he has seen so far, but he looks all the way down and he goes down into it, he looks down onto Earth, okay? But he essentially tells us that he is a Gemini. So we know that he is born sometime in Gemini. In the medieval period, Gemini was associated with the month of June, okay? So we always mark his birthday. In fact, at his silent tomb in Santa Croce, there is a big to-do, which we'll talk about here at the end, on June 1st, always, to mark his birthday. But what year? Because, of course, we don't have birth certificates. We don't have, and certainly in the comedy, he doesn't tell us exactly his birth year. But we do have one of the things that we have, one of the official documents. I should tell you, we have nothing in Dante's hands. Nothing has come to us. So no manuscript, unlike Petrarch, for example, right? Unlike Boccaccio, we have nothing from Dante. But we do have his baptismal record, okay? You may know that during the period, Dante was born in 1265, during this period, there were 2 baptisms a year. That's going to change fairly quickly after Dante's birth, and they're going to start baptizing every day. This whole idea of limbo and unbaptized babies got to be way too terrifying. And so they are going to change that. But because we know that in 1265, 1266, when we have his baptismal record from that year, we have to, this was the first baptism of 1266, so he had to have been born in June of 1265. So this is how we get his birth year, is because of his baptismal year. And he's baptized in the baptistry of San Giovanni. You may or may not know, all Florentines were baptized there. It is not like today. It wasn't like today where you have a baptismal font in every church, right? This was the common practice was that you would have one baptistry, you would baptize there, and then you would be allowed, let's say, into the temple, into the church. And so he was baptized in this round in 1266. And so for Dante, just like for his contemporaries, the baptistry is the place, and he's a poet, so he's going to tell us this most beautifully. But the baptistry is the place that you become a Florentine. The place where you become a Christian, obviously, of course it is, right? That's the rite that takes place, the sacrament of baptism. You become a Florentine at the baptistry. So for Dante, that is going to be the place in Florence that he is going to most deeply and most intimately connect with, especially in terms of his Florentine-ness. Now, what's going on in Florence at this time? So I never tire of saying that Dante, who was born in 1265, and we'll read the comedy, and those of you who have read the comedy, it is set in the year 1300, and here we are 724 years later reading it, and we find so many parallels. This was a society undergoing a massive, massive change and a massive shift and a revolution. The Fiorino d'Oro that I put up here, it's so enormous. I mean, the Florentines would probably have loved to see it blown up to this size. The Fiorino d'Oro, the gold florin that was minted 13 years before Dante was born in 1252. This is the second gold coin that was minted. The first one was in Genova, but those Genovese got a little bit shifty with their mint, and they started throwing in all different sorts of metals, and so the gold monetary unit did not last. Here in Florence, instead, in 1252, the Fiorino d'Oro, 3.5 grams. Okay, this is pure gold. 1252, it becomes the standard currency all over Europe. So here is Florence. There's Franco Cardini. He's a historian. He's a medieval historian here in Florence. And he has this beautiful kind of catchphrase that he uses all the time to talk about Florence during this period. He says, per mistero o per miracolo, by mystery or by miracle. Florence becomes the right, one of these, certainly, but the leading economy. This is a city that is not on the Via Francigena. We were left off the Via Francigena when it was created in the 11th century. It is on the Via Romea, the Roman road, but that's not what was being used. Our river, God, we love it, God bless it, but it's not navigable, right? This isn't a river where things were being shipped and brought in. Okay? We don't have a port city at this time. So all these strikes against Florence that, you do your medieval checklist, it's got none of them checked off, right? Pilgrim Road, no. Commerce, that's done. River, not navigable. No port, none of this. So no port to serve the city. So the idea that by per mistero, per miracolo, by mystery or by miracle, 1252, and then Dante is born into this in 1265. And it will not come as a shock to you that he is going to ascribe, when he writes the Divine Comedy, it is a salvation story. He has a lot to say about Florence, and he will ascribe the majority of its ills to the Fiorino d'Oro, the greed. Those greedy Florentines, they just want money. It's all about money. It's not like back in the day where it was about your family and where you came from, okay? This is a new society. Things are changing. They are changing quickly, and not everyone loves change. I mean, the more things change, right? The more they stay the same. Same goes for this idea of the urbanization of Florence. This was a moment, it had started certainly in the 12th century, but there was all over the peninsula of Italy, we start to see people from the countryside that start to come into these urban centers. So Florence, Florencia, that had been an ancient Roman foundation city, was now starting to sort of roar back to life during this period. So here again, everything is changing. I mean, think about what this means if we think about the early 1200s and all of these people that start to come into the center of Florence. Florence is still, I mean, you're looking at it. This was it back then as well. And so where do you want to be? You want to be in the center. Who can afford to be in the center? The people who are the landed gentry who are coming in, the people who have already the power. You start to have these borghi, you start to have these communities that start to grow around the edges of the city. This offers a whole, I mean, in so many different ways, this offers so many different opportunities if we think about the church. And we think about the rise of those mendicant orders, which are going to so profoundly influence Dante and his work. The Dominicans, the Franciscans in particular, they're talking to those people. They're talking to the people in the borghi saying, there's dignity in poverty. Here, come learn about Christ. He didn't go to church. These weren't people who had heard the word of God. So here the church is capitalizing, yes, we want to be able to talk to them. How are they talking to them? These mendicant orders, when they start to form, the whole idea, besides the vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience, is that they are getting a sign off from the Pope to be able to preach. You had to have the permission of a bishop typically to be able to preach. Well, the Dominicans and the Franciscans go to the bishop of all the bishops, to the Pope, and say, can we just preach everywhere? If we promise, to always follow your rules, and the Pope say yes. And so they sign these rules. They're speaking in the language of the people. So this is, imagine how profoundly this is going to affect Dante, as we're going to see as he writes his epic in the vernacular. So language is changing, the cities are changing, and he is born right in the middle of all of this. So Dante sort of changes his tune. He writes the Divine Comedy over about a, 12-year period, something like this, okay, 12, 13-year period. When he starts off in the Inferno and he's talking about his family, he makes us infer a lot of things. So he's sort of quiet and leaves the empty spaces to sort of speak. By the time he gets to Paradiso, so he's releasing each of the books, Inferno goes out, Purgatorio goes out. By the time he gets to Paradiso, it's late 13 teens, and Dante has really honed his story about who he is. He's spent all this time in the noble courts, and he says now he gives us his sort of family tree. But what we know is that Dante is more or less from this area. I imagine you all have been to this area, right? To the place where Dante's house in quotes there. Dante's house, it's very sweet. If you go, it's actually not so sweet, but the what they say we're the best of all the fakes. We know we're a fake, but we're the best of all the fakes, which is so Florentine, humility zero, but just like putting it out there. We're the best of all the fakes. But we know that he comes from this area, from this neighborhood. And we know this because of a couple of things. Number one, he tells us, again, in the comedy, sort of gives us a little bit of an idea. He talks about the bells of the Badia, for example, that the Florentine abbey, that were the bells that sanctioned his day. We have a document that talks about his family land that borders a convent, a church convent called Santa Margherita. There was a bit of a dispute over a fig tree, and so at least we're kind of getting an idea of where. He tells us that his parish church is San Martino. So looking at a map, you can sort of have an understanding about that. And so I include that. I actually walked through here. I live very close to this neighborhood, and I walked through, and I have to say I'm always happy when there are groups there because they're talking about Dante, so what's not to love? But they're all looking down at the pavement because there's that etching of Dante that you pour water on and you can see his face. And anyway, I think that's as far as many groups get with their Dante knowledge. I also include this, which is facing. So it's sort of where we're standing to be looking over the little piazzetta there. There's this wonderful relief that is called I luoghi familiari di Dante. So the familiar places of Dante, essentially saying not all of this was here, but some of the things that were here that are still here. And so we have the Casa di Dante, of course. We have the baptistry, the Church of Santa Margherita, the Torre della Castagna, the Chestnut Tower, so on and so forth. So I have quite an affection for this relief because it does give us at least an idea of the places that we can still see, the Bargello, the Badia, so on and so forth. So Dante comes from a family that were, in reality, they were very low-level nobility. So they did have a title. He has a last name. This is big business, right? If you have a last name already in the 13th century. And we know that he tells us in another one of his works called the Vian NOA, he says, he kind of speaks poorly about his father, saying, oh, my father was a moneylender. I'm not really did this sort of business. He doesn't want to have anything to do with it. He's a poet, right? So it's all about the arts. But he's talks about how he's a little bit ashamed of his father. but it also shows us, yes, they had a bit of status, but they were not above having to do jobs like money lending, so on and so forth. Having said that, Dante comes from a family where he had private tutors. So he absolutely, this is way before we had schools. Later in the 14th century, you'll have the abaco, you'll have the sort of math school for the merchants. Sons that will be set up. But if you have the means, you have private tutors that come and that will teach you at home. So he is educated in all of the subjects that we would expect someone of his status and his class. He did not have ancient Greek. That will come in later. In fact, he's very uncomfortable about this when he's in Inferno and he sees Ulysses. He sort of tells Virgil, like, you go talk to him because I'm a little embarrassed. I don't have Greek. And Virgil's saying, yeah, well, he's going to get mad at me anyway because I only speak Latin. And, they're arguing about the soul of Ulysses, Odysseus, making fun of them, essentially. So he doesn't have that, but he does do the grammar, logic, rhetoric, and then, of course, work in arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. So nothing specialized, but certainly that liberal arts education, again, that would have made perfect sense for someone at his level. I also put down on the lower right-hand side that he attended lectures, so kind of philosophy and theology lectures at the churches of Santa Croce and Santa Maria Novella. Those are our two big Dominican, Santa Maria Novella, and Franciscan, Santa Croce centers. They were not the churches that we see today. Both of those churches, well, Santa Maria Novella was finished around 1270. Santa Croce, as we know it, the current church, was started in 1294 or 95. But at any rate, there were in the first church is certainly where he would go. In the chapter house, they would host lectures. These are the friars that would have been educated in places like Bologna, Padova, though that was more scientific, Paris. And then they would come to places like Florence where there was no university. Florence will only have a university the year after the plague, so 1349. And then under Lorenzo the Magnificent, the Medici, the university moves to Pisa. So Florence has never had a big university culture. And certainly during Dante's time, it didn't at all. It didn't have any kind of university structure, but you would go, again, if you were someone like Dante, you would go and you would listen to these lectures. So he was auditing, right, using his auditory skills, and he was auditing these lectures and these lessons that the friars were giving because they were the ones who had the theological and philosophical education. What about the language? I sort of mentioned the vernacular briefly, but what is going on sort of on the streets of Florence and in administration? Latin was absolutely used for all types of administration, be it civic or religious. Okay, and then the vernacular is the spoken language. So what is actually being spoken on the streets in the piazzas? But in terms of poetry, what is being written in which language, right? The vernacular was used for love poetry. And this comes from, if you start to study Italian literature, you start in the 12th and then on into the 13th century with love poetry. I mean, you start with St. Francis, who essentially is writing a love poem to God. And then you move on into courtly love poetry at the Scuola Siciliana and these sorts of things. So love poetry always written in the vernacular. It makes sense. It's love. It's the vernacular. You want to be able to express yourself in the most immediate way possible. But epic poetry. So if we're thinking about, remember, this is a moment where we have our first fragments of the Italian vernacular in the 10th century. So this is quite late. I mean, if you're going to compare it to English, for example. The vernacular that is just starting to kind of come into its own. Epic poetry, the language of epic poetry was either ancient Greek, as we spoke about, or Latin, right? It was a language that had a structured, a set out, and an illustrious grammar and a history behind it. Epic poetry is the highest form of poetry. So you're going to use the linguistic equivalent, right? The highest linguistic equivalent. So love poetry being written in the vernacular, this is where Dante is going to blow everything out of the water. In terms of poetry and philosophy, who is Dante hanging around with, or how is he sort of how is he learning his trade? Dante will never have a quote unquote real job. He will always be a poet and a paid poet. And certainly at the same time that all of these shifts and changes are going on all of these different levels that we've spoken about, in poetry, we have Guido Cavalcanti, who he will call his first friend, his best friend. In some of his early poetry, he's a generation, a few years, not that really a generation, half a generation older than Dante, and really the beginnings of a poetic movement that is called the Stil Nuovo, or the Dolce Stil Nuovo, the sweet new style. What is that doing? It's taking the kind of idea of love poetry, the woman, rather than just being, a kind of sublimated ideal as it was in the courtly love tradition. The woman now becomes a sort of connector, like an angel woman, a connector to God. So they're bringing divine love into the equation. So this is how Dante is formed at the very beginning of his poetic career. I should mention too that how does one become a poet? How is Dante going from the lectures in the chapter houses of the Franciscan and Dominican churches into meeting someone like Guido Cavalcanti or having any kind of relationship? I've said this in other lectures before. I think it must be the most terrifying way ever, is that you would write. So Dante would write a poem or a selection of poems, and he would send them to the circle. He would send them to the illustrious circle to say, what do you think? And they would answer back. And they're Florentines. They're not going to mince words. If it's garbage, they're going to tell you, and they're going to be brutal about it. Of course, Dante starts writing to people like Guido Cavalcanti, and they're going, who's this kid? We want to know more. So he starts by creating these relationships. I also put Brunetto Latini. He was a philosopher here in Florence. Giovanni Villani, who's a great chronicler in the 14th century, says Latini was a great philosopher and a consummate master of rhetoric, not only in knowing how to speak well, but how to write well. And from what we can sort of piece together is that that Brunetto Latini was one of the primary formative teachers of Dante. Those of you who have read the comedy or will read it together in the Divine Dante course will see Brunetto Latini does end up in Inferno, actually, and they have a very interesting interaction when they're there. Politically, we all know the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, right? You all know the differences. The easiest way to do this, and I'm distilling it embarrassingly here, but Guelphs, little short Guelph, Pope. Ghibelline, longer word, emperor. It's the easiest way to remember, okay? It really, I'm giving you, again, the kind of very easy definition here. What does this mean? It means that there were these two spheres of influences two spheres of influence. The Guelphs tended towards a papal influence, the Ghibellines toward an imperial influence. What is the reality of the situation? I'm a Guelph because you're my enemy and you're a Ghibelline. And so it became something that sort of divided up relationships on a much more local level. But whole cities, right, they would pass from one party to another. And so there are these historic battles between certain cities in Florence. So here again, here's Dante, who is born into the Guelph-Ghibelline kind of conflict. And he may or may not have fought actually in the definitive battle called Campaldino in 1289, which is the definitive battle that essentially says no more Ghibelline rule in Florence. So from that moment, Florence becomes a Guelph city. It had from about 1215 until this point, there had been, kind of decades of Guelph Ghibelline trading off power, exile, as we're going to see, on and on and on. Perhaps he fought in the Battle of Campaldino. If you go to the Casa di Dante, they have a piece of chainmail, something like Dante would have worn, a dagger, perhaps used by Dante, a Campaldino. It's so you can kind of make up your mind about this. He certainly didn't win any prizes for his valor on the battlefield. We have no real evidence that he fought. So I always say, in 1289, you would think once the Guelph Ghibelline thing was over that everything would be fine and everyone live happily ever after. Of course they don't, because there was so much anxiety and there was so much tension between, remember that gold florin, right? There's so much anxiety and so much tension between this new merchant class who's all about the fiorino d'oro, all about the money, okay, and the much more established nobility in Florence. And so what you start to see is, and in fact, the bianchi, the white Guelphs, and I won't get into, again, there's the lecture on it if you want to know all about the blacks and the whites and where they come from and why they're named. The idea being that the bianchi are more imperial and the neri are more papal, but the reality is actually the blacks, for example, that are headed up by the Donati family. This is a noble family. Families like the Donati were very frustrated after Campaldino because they had financed the entire thing. And then in 1293, a series of ordinances were passed that said only guild members can be priors. Only they can be part of the political class. If you belong to a noble family, if you're a magnate, if you are a magnate, your name is written in the book of the magnates and you are out. So all of a sudden, this class of people who said, well, we paid for that whole thing. That was us. They're completely out because what's starting to happen is the merchant class is starting to take power because of the power of the florin. And so here again, this is the moment that Dante is coming of age. In Florence, you come of age at age 30 if you are a man. Okay, that's when you can join a guild. That's usually when you marry, for example. Now, Dante's father dies when he's 18. And so he did take over. We know that he takes over, sort of administering for his family at that time. But I mentioned the guilds. You had to be a guild member in order to participate in politics, and you wanted to participate in politics. It's not, like today where you run screaming from the entire thing. No, this is a time when that's how you had a voice. That's how you had a voice. And so anyone who was a part of one of the 7 major guilds, these kind of corporations, these trade unions almost, they're the ones who are running the show. Dante here, this is from the 15th century by Andrea del Castagno, but this is Dante in his lucco, in his red robes of his office. Red during the medieval and early modern period, you could only wear red if you were a ruler. That's the rule. And so you always know if someone is wearing red, okay, then they have to be either part of the ruling class or a duke, or it's why the Pope wears the red shoes. If you've ever heard about the red shoes, Pope Francis is the first pope who said no red shoes. I won't wear them, because he knows what they mean. They mean temporal power, rulership. So here's Dante. He is a member of this class because he had joined in 1295 when he's 30, the Guild of the Doctors and Apothecaries. He was neither doctor nor apothecary. It doesn't matter. You can join whatever guild. The important thing is you pay your dues and you show up to meetings, right? You abide by the rules. The whole point is to belong, okay? You have to belong. You have to be part of the process. You have to be part of the guild structure to be able to participate. So here, and again, this makes perfect sense for Dante given his family connections and so on and so forth. So he joins in 1295. I wanted to read this to you. I'm going to read this here from my screen. This is Giovanni Boccaccio. We'll talk about in a moment how completely influential he was in the whole kind of PR of the comedy. But he had sort of gotten an obsession with Dante later in his life, and he traveled all up and down the peninsula, interviewing everyone who had ever even heard of having seen Dante. But he interviews Dante's nephew, Andrea, and Andrea says this. So let's just get an idea about what Dante looks like around age 30. Boccaccio says, our poet then was of middle height, and when he had reached maturity, he went somewhat bowed, his gait grave and gentle, and ever clad in most seemly apparel, in such garb as benefited his mature years. His face was long, his nose aquiline, and his eyes large rather than small, his jaws big, and the under lip protruding beyond the upper, not doing many favors to him. His complexion was dark, and his hair and beard thick, who knew? Black and curling, and his expression was always melancholy and thoughtful. Okay, so it's not exactly what we think about when we think about that. You know, this is much more the image that we have. Maybe the aquiline nose and the red robes, those certainly have stayed behind. Now, I haven't mentioned her yet, so here's her big entrance. Beatrice, of course, right? Now, let's see. The situation is this. It's 1295. He's joined the guild. He's also going to publish, as we're going to talk about in just one moment, his first real collection of poetry called the Vita Nuova, or at least that's the name that's given to it. He sort of says, I'm starting a new life. And it was after the death of someone that he calls Beatrice. It is going to be Boccaccio in a series of lectures in the 1370s that tells us, oh, it's Beatrice Portinari, daughter of Folco Portinari. And Folco Portinari was a very, very important Florentine figure. He founded the Spedale di Santa Maria Nuova, which I hope that you haven't had to experience it, but thankfully it is still running. 13th century hospital. He's the founder of this incredibly important family, much more important than the Alighieri family, Dante's family. So in no way, shape, or form would a Beatrice Portinari and a Dante Durante Alighieri ever have had the opportunity really to even, you know, kind of go to one party together, I think, but certainly not to have any kind of serious relationship. So whether or not it is Beatrice Portinari or whether it is Beatrice, the bringer of beatitudini, the bringer of blessings, right? This is her name that is given to her. I always feel like I tell people there's no Santa Claus when I start to say, maybe it was Beatrice Portinari, maybe it was just a name that he invented. Anyway, there are a couple of other biographical things that match up. So I'm not going to take Beatrice Portinari completely out of the story. But my point is that Dante, in this period, was not married to Beatrice. In fact, will never be married to Beatrice. We'll talk about in just one moment who he was married to. But he will write in 1295, rather, he will publish. He writes it from about 1292 to 1294, what we now call La Vita Nuova. So there's the very first line, he says, this is the beginning of the new life. This is how he starts the entire collection of poems. And so we now have given it the title of Vita Nuova. The Vita Nuova is, so I brought my favorite, it's the Barbara Reynolds translation. So it's tiny, you know, it's just a little slender volume. But it is in the poetic tradition where he introduces each poem, whether it be a sonnet, a ballata, canzone, whatever it is, he introduces it with prose and then he follows it up. So he tells us this poem is going to be about, and he lists everything out. And then he gives us the poem. And then at the end of the poem, he says, now in line 1, when I said this, this is what I meant. And in line 2, when I said this, this is what I meant. And it's glorious because it's like having Dante sitting next to you, explaining every single thing. I will say that you know, there are people, Dante Gabriel Rossetti in particular, who went to translate this and said, he is so annoying, always telling me what these are about. He made his brother actually translate the prose portions. He says, he's getting on my nerves. I want to just translate the poetry. You do the prose part. I don't want him in my head. And so they teamed up on this. I personally love it. But the whole idea here is that it's his love for Beatrice and then the grief at her death, because Beatrice, he tells us, dies in 1290. So this is him telling us all about Beatrice. I mean, it is wonderful. Truly, truly, highly recommend the Vita Nuova. At one point, he, I won't read it to you just in the interest of time, but he sees her coming down the street. You know, he's kind of standing there and he says, I see her, and she's flanked by two other illustrious women, but the most illustrious was in the middle, and they're walking down the street, and he gets so nervous. All he can do is say, Salve. And she, you know, sort of raises her hand in greeting and goes on about her passeggiata and goes on about her way. And then he goes home. He tells us all of this. He goes home. He is shaking. He cannot contain himself from her having, you know, the interaction that they had had. He goes home. He throws himself on the bed. He falls into this tormented sleep. And in this dream, right after this interaction, a hooded figure comes, black cloak, hooded figure. He's carrying something. He's advancing towards Dante, who's there in bed. It's like a vivid dream, you know. And the figure tilts this woman that he's holding in his arms. You know, she's wrapped in this fire red cloak, and he tilts her, and it's Beatrice. And the cloaked figure says, behold your heart. This is after hello. Agreed. This. Okay. So imagine what the Vita Nuova is about. It is amazing. But he gives us, in not only in the poetry, but also, of course, in the prose, he gives us so much wonderful information. He invents a whole screen woman. He says, oh, I think people are on to me. That they know I'm after Beatrice and I'm lusting after her in church. So he invents what he calls a screen woman. Someone who says, oh, one of my friends saw me looking at so-and-so. Were you looking at, you know, Matilda over there? And Dante goes, oh, yeah, that's exactly who I was looking at. Yeah, oh, you found me out. And so this Matilda, whatever, I can't remember her name, becomes a screen woman. Dante goes so, you know, he just completely gives himself over to this whole farce that this woman and her family leave Florence. They move, and he writes a bunch of poems about how sad he is that she's left the screen woman, because he has to keep up the act of the screen woman, lest someone find out that he's lusting after Beatrice. Meanwhile, he's married, not to the screen woman, not to Beatrice, but to someone called Gemma Donati. Now, in the black and white split moment of the Guelphs, Dante tended to support the white Guelphs. So the Cerchi were the family that headed up the circles, headed up the white Guelphs. And Donati was the name of the black Guelphs. So Corso Donati was the head. This is a cousin of Corso Donati. So what do we have? We have a typical situation where we have an attempt to bring the warring sides together by saying, let's marry these two, one from the whites, one from the blacks. And then once they start having kids, this is how we're going to heal these wounds, right? That keep coming up. So he's married to Gemma Donati. And they have at least these children, perhaps a Giovanni as well, but certainly Pietro Jacopo and Antonia. So they do have children. We know nothing about Gemma Donati. I mean, truly, we know her name. We know some of the children's names. What we think we know is they had a terrible relationship, because he was always, you know, after Beatrice. But also, when Dante will go into exile, Gemma does not follow. And for Boccaccio and for this next generation, you know, this is scandalous. Well, And then we get scandalized because they tell us this, and then you don't bother learning that very rarely did women and young children, as they were at the time, go into exile with the father, with the head of the house. It would only usually be when it got to be an exile that was looking permanent that the family would leave. And in fact, we have all evidence points to Gemma and certainly the children leaving Florence at a certain point once it became clear that Dante was not going to be coming back. And so my point is, we don't know anything about their relationship. We know they were married, and we know that they had several children. Many of you might have had lunch under this portrait at the fishing lab, because, you know, the Fiorino d'Oro did not stop in the 13th century. In Florence now, it's, you know, restaurants on every corner, and you can eat at the fishing lab, which is a perfectly yummy seafood restaurant. But you can eat in the former home of the Palazzo dei Giudici, so the judges and notaries guild. And there's a portrait of Dante. And so this is one of the earliest, if not the earliest. This is after his death, but at any rate, he's there. So Dante participates in politics. He's 30. He's joined the guild. What does this mean? He gets to now be eligible to be a prior, okay, one of the city priors. And he becomes a prior in the year 1300. In the year 1300. Priors usually between 6 and 8. At the time of Dante, there were 8 members of the kind of city council members, let's call them that. They have all the power. They hold the power, and they rotate every 2 months. So the spring, summer of the year 1300, Dante was a prior. He was a prior, and there was no Palazzo della Signoria. That was being built at this time. Okay, so now we call it Palazzo Vecchio. They were not meeting there. They were meeting in churches. That's what you did all over Tuscany. You met in churches. City councils met in churches because it was big enough to be able to host everyone. Here I've just put up the image of a plaque that is on the church on the side of what was the church of San Pier Scheraggio, which was incorporated into the Uffizi when the Uffizi was built. So there's a plaque there that talks about how these are the remains and the vestiges of the church of San Pier Scheraggio that gave its name to one of the quarters, the 6 neighborhood sestieri of the city, and in whose walls, this is the plaque says, in the walls where the Consigli del Popolo, so the city council, the voice of Dante rang out because he was a member of this city council. So it's a bit of a Dante moment there. And I just put the image here just so you can understand where it was. This was a very turbulent, extraordinarily violent moment. There were riots constantly throughout the spring and summer of 1300. So here's Dante, who is presiding over the city council or working with the city council amidst some of the worst violence that Florence had really seen. Pope Boniface VIII, who was the Pope at the time, Dante and some of his colleagues decide, we're going to go down to Rome. We're going to speak with Pope Boniface VIII. This was very normal. It was the traditional thing to do, was to go down and beg the Pope, say, can you come and broker a peace? Things have gotten completely out of control between the blacks and whites. It's rioting. Will you come and broker a peace? This happens all through the Middle Ages. As Dante and his colleagues are down in Rome, Pope Boniface VIII receives them, says, yes, you know, my sons, I will look into this. I certainly, you know, I will help you out, and please, you know, get on your way and go back to Florence. And unbeknownst to all of them, he had already made a deal with the French, a member of the French royal family, and with Corso Donati, who was the head of the Blacks, to stage a coup. And so this is why Dante and Petrarch's father, by the way, are making their way back from Rome when they learn that they have been accused. And in Dante's case, it was accused of bribery of a public official. Okay, this was his charge that was brought against him. So these 3 are working together. He was given a some extraordinary, like 5,000 florins or something, like a working poet was not going to be able to pay this. And they said, you have 2 weeks, or you'll be sentenced to death. And so, of course, he can't pay it. And so this is why Dante, it's not true exile with Dante in the sense that he was sure allowed to come back to Florence. He would just be killed as soon as he did. So let's call it a self-imposed exile. And so this is the moment, right? We're in 1300, 1301, beginning of 1302 at this point. So another one of the documents that we have that has his name, again, this is not in his handwriting, is the list of names of all the people who were accused in this batch. They were all, of course, white 12. And Durante Alighieri is there, so Dante Alighieri. So he, at that point, never comes back to Florence. He will go into exile, and for a time, he kind of banded together with the other whites. He goes to Arezzo with Francesco Petrarca's father and family, and he kind of hangs with them, and they're all scheming and trying to figure out, how can we get back into Florence? How can we make this happen? And then Dante, after about 4 years, he just says, you know what? I'm not going to do it. It's depressing. All they talk about is getting back into Florence. He starts losing hope. And he says, I don't want to be around them all the time. I'm going to go. And he says, I'm going to be a party on my own. This is insanity, okay, in this moment. This is a time. Imagine if you have no passport, you have no bancomat, ATM, you have no access to, imagine the situation. All you have are the people, your people that you've been identifying with. And Dante says, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to leave them behind, and I'm going to find a way to survive that doesn't include this group of people. And so Dante, he goes, we're not sure. We like to think we know exactly where Dante was and when. We do, of course, have letters, and we know for certain that he was in certain places, absolutely, because he writes from there. Dante was a very well-known poet. This is the thing. The King of France, who had come to Florence in the 1290s, Dante was hauled out. The city said, we want you to come and recite some poetry for the king. So Dante is someone who's very well known. He's, as I said, a working poet. And so what does he do? Who's going to give him hospitality? These wealthy, noble families all throughout central and northern Italy. What does he get in return? Well, he gets not only food, a bed, a place to stay, he gets a library, okay? He gets a library, he gets a place to be able to write, and he gets to be able to be affiliated with these families. What do they get? They get a really illustrious Florentine poet to be able to be a bit of an ambassador, kind of run missions to various other courts. It was a feather in their cap to have him, of course, there. Now, we talked about the Vian NOA. He writes, I feel bad calling these minor works, but the Convivio, which is another work written in the vernacular, and it's all about philosophy. It's a big banquet. This is what Convivio means. It's a banquet, and it is presided over by Lady Philosophy. And so everyone is welcome. This is why it's written in the vernacular. It says, everybody's welcome. Come sit at the table of knowledge and philosophy, and we're going to have a talk. De Vulgare Eloquentia is written in Latin, and this is on the vernacular, and on the vernacular, the Vulgare Eloquentia, the illustrious vernacular. But it is written in Latin because it is a treatise on language. So it's for specialists. It's not for everyone, the way that the Convivio is. And then De Monarchia, which is another philosophical work that is about the two spheres of power. So the papacy and De Monarchia, of course, is on the monarchy. The Commedia, of course, is his masterwork. It's what he is remembered for, and he writes this in exile. So he's not in Florence. He starts it maybe 1307, 1308. We're not really sure, and he finishes it just before he dies in September of 1321. Okay, so he's writing it this whole entire time, and he's releasing as he's finished. So Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso, and he's releasing them out. Why is it called the Commedia? the comedy, because it ends well, it starts very badly, going down into he's in the dark wood, he's terrified, he has these three beasts in front of him, he doesn't know what to do. Boom, the shade of Virgil, ancient Roman poet, comes, says, come on, we got it, the only way out is through, let's go down. They go down to the depths of hell, they make their way up the mountain of purgatory, and it ends, as we started, with Dante seeing God. So it's a story that starts badly and ends well. That's a comedy, okay? Not a laugh out loud, but it's a comedy. A tragedy is the opposite, right? So this is not La Divina Tragedia, okay? That would start well and end badly. So this is why it's called the Commedia. Now, the Commedia is 100 canti, okay? 100 canti, these are sort of like chapters. So there are 34 in Inferno. It's basically 33 plus an introductory, 33 in Purgatorio, 33 in Paradiso. And he writes it in the vernacular. He writes it in the spoken language of Florence. As we said, this is unheard of, okay? You don't write epic poetry in the vernacular. You write epic poetry in Latin, okay? He does not. He says, nope, I'm not just going to tell you what the vernacular can do. I'm going to show you what the vernacular can do. And so he writes the comedy. The Divine Comedy is a revolutionary work. I'm never going to stop saying it, okay? It's a revolutionary work. And I think if you were, luckily, my son is now in his first year of high school, but when he was in middle school, he graced us with his presence a couple of times during COVID and Dante things, but he loved Dante, thank God. But most kids don't. Most kids, that's like getting beat over the head with it, like, oh, this guy again, the Commedia again. It's because, as usual, right, the things that make it so fascinating are typically, and I'm not blaming teachers, God knows, but those things tend to kind of go into second place. The Divine Comedy is a revolution. It is a revolution on so many different fronts, but certainly the language. So using the vernacular, it's called copia, the range that Dante uses. So the lowest of the low to the highest of the high in terms of the style of language that he's using. He invents the structure. It's called rhyming tercet. So it's that A, B, A, B, C, B. Every line of the comedy interacts with the line above and below it. So it's a way of not only making sure that no one's going to mess with the structure, right? Because you'll notice if a line changes, okay, if a word changes, you're going to notice. But it's also just human error. I mean, it's a wonderful way if you think about it. But it's very complex, but it's also incredibly flexible. So he's able to make the most of the vernacular. It's told in the first person, an epic. Imagine Achilles telling us his own story. Odysseus saying, this is what happened. And so then I went up to Circe's and I was like, it's amazing that we have an epic poem written in the first person. The sheer number of characters. There's everyone. Florentines, contemporary and past. There are biblical figures, mythological figures. You name it, they're there. So just the sheer number of figures alone, it is so rich. Political realities, mystical, moral. I mean, everything is there. He's treating everything in different books, really concentrate, whether it's Inferno, Purgatorio, or Paradiso, concentrate on different themes. It is a salvation story. It is his salvation story. He says, this happened. I woke up in a dark wood. I went down. Virgil helped me. We went up the mountain of purgatory, and then we went into Paradiso. But guess what? It can happen to you too. If you also go through this journey, it can happen. And guess what? It can happen to Florence, and it can happen to the peninsula of Italy, and it can happen to Europe. And so it's this universal salvation story that Dante tells us in very personal terms. The fact that he has Beatrice, so it's Virgil, the shade of the ancient Roman poet, who takes him through the first two realms of Inferno and Purgatorio. He has Beatrice meet him at the top of the mountain of purgatory in the Garden of Eden, and she's the one who takes him up into Paradiso. So this Florentine woman, he can't even move without her. In Paradiso, seriously, the divine light is too bright she tells him she's very mean to Dante, but she's very mean. But she's always saying, Dante, look at me. Look at me. Actually, she's not saying his name. She's just looking at him saying, you have to stay on my eyes because she can handle the divine light. She's already blessed. So he goes through her. Literally, she is the tool, right, of his salvation. So he's moving up through these spheres thanks to her. I'm just very quickly showing you. I'm not going to go through the Commedia by any means, but you probably are familiar, right, with that funnel shape of hell. This is Sandro Botticelli. These are just images here of details of the map of hell that I just showed you. It's completely fascinating. You get your magnifying glass, or it's online. It's a digital image, so you can go in and have a ball on this. But the just intricate system that Dante creates. There's a little bit more. This is again Botticelli. Something just kind of fun fact, every single book of the Divine Comedy ends with the word stelle, stars. So this is uscimmo a rivedere le stelle. So we exited to see the stars again. So there's Dante and Virgilio. They make their way up the mountain of purgatory. As I said, this is personally my favorite book. It is the most human of all the books. And they make their way up, the most human of all the cantiques, they're called. They make their way up the terraces of vice, along with Virgil, of course. And as I said, he will meet Beatrice in the Garden of Eden, and then she will be the one to take him up through Paradiso. And Paradiso, the deal with Paradiso is this: everyone gets to be next to God. Okay, this is how you live for all of eternity. Once you have gone through purgatory, if you had to, which most people do. Let's be honest. Hell, very crowded. Purgatory, pretty crowded. Paradiso, no. They go for long stretches without running into anything. And so, but what happens is, so everyone lives, but in order to tell a story, it would be really boring if you just gave us hell and all these different layers and purgatory and all these different levels. And then you go to Paradiso and you go, oh, everybody lives with God. No, so they put on, it's a kind of one night only show that they put on for Dante, and Dante has kind of characters that come in and occupy the certain realms of heaven that they are explaining. So something that had to do with them, so they'll be explaining and speaking with Dante. It is just it's truly incredible. And so he makes his way, as I said, the way in Inferno and Purgatory, they walk through the entire thing. In Paradiso, he looks at Beatrice's eyes and goes up. So the very final vision, again, where he sees God, and so the Commedia ends. The Divina part, the divine part of the Commedia comes from Boccaccio. So he, in about 1372 to 1374, right before he dies, he doesn't get through the whole thing, he starts lecturing, and he tells us a lot. Actually, he wrote a biography. He tells us, as he's taking us through each canto, he says, oh, Francesca is Francesca da Rimini, and here's her story. And so a lot of the things that we still to this day think and sort of know about the comedy come from this. And he's the one who calls it not la commedia, ma la divina commedia, the divine comedy. So this is the chapel at the Badia Fiorentina where he did these readings. And then just to end, Dante on the baptistry. So if you go to the baptistry and you're looking at the eastern door and look down on inside of the, where the, it's cordoned off, there's the, sort of gate there. But if you look down on the ground, there's a Dante plaque, and it is this series of tercets from Paradiso. Dante is being quizzed by Saints Peter and James, which sounds terrible, on the theological virtues, no pressure. And he says, there's this beautiful moment where he says, if it should happen, if this sacred poem, so he's now talking about the Divine Comedy, if this sacred poem, this work so shared by heaven and by earth, that it has made me lean through these long years, So here he's telling us, he's put so much work into this, can ever overcome the cruelty that bars me from the fair fold where I slept, a lamb, opposed to wolves that wore on it. So he's just a little lamb, and he had been exiled by these terrible wolves. By then, with other voice, with other fleece, his voice has gotten softer. He's older, right? He's gone gray, white, with another fleece. I shall return as poet and put on at my baptismal font the laurel crown. For there I first found entry to that faith which makes souls welcome unto God. And then for that faith, Peter garlanded my brow. So he's saying if he's outlining, as I said, he's getting quizzed on the theological virtues. This is the theological virtue of hope that he is outlining. So this is his hope, that he will be brought back to Florence. He will be given the laurel crown in the baptistry, in his place where he learned of the faith, but of course where he also became a Florentine. So on that note, I will wrap up, and I'm happy to have questions or anything else. I don't want to touch.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. Oh, sorry, a bit brutal, a bit sudden. I should have done one at a time. Anyhow, wow, tour de force. Everything you always wanted to know about Dante, and then some more. And then lots more to come if you want to dive actually into the comedy itself. So don't miss the opportunity. So questions and answers, and on the Zoom, the chat is now open. So the Zoomers, as always, can talk to us on the chat. You can open up. Where's it gone? There it is. And in the room, if you want to ask a question or make a comment, put your hand up so we can use the microphone so that the Zoomers can hear you. And if there's any bold Zoomers out there who want to unmute and talk to us, we can hear you in the room, which is always nice as well. So who wants to go first? There we have. Right there.
Hi, that was absolutely fabulous. When did Dante become popular outside of Tuscany, outside of Italy, and known more broadly in Christendom?
Turn it back on. So when did he become more known? I mean, truthfully, even during his lifetime, he was quite well known, and the comedy traveled throughout the peninsula of Italy. So right away, there, as with all works of art, there are sort of peaks and troughs, and so we know that in the 15th century, for example, that this is a story that I always love. Michelangelo, very young Michelangelo, kind of follows the Medici into exile in 1494, and they go to Bologna first. And Michelangelo is he's affiliated with the Medici, but he's not wealthy. He doesn't have fancy friends. So the Medici find someone there in Bologna for him to stay with. And as part of the deal, sort of having young Michelangelo staying at their home in Bologna, the man of the house sort of said, as to kind of earn your keep, you'll recite Dante to us, because there's nothing more beautiful than hearing Dante in the mouth that it was, with the tongue that it was supposed to be pronounced by. And Michelangelo was a great scholar of Dante. Botticelli, as we've seen, there were numerous versions in the 15th century. Boccaccio was instrumental. I mean, him holding the lectures, but also writing a biography. It was so over the top, the biography of Dante, that someone called Leonardo Bruni, a humanist in Florence in the 15th century, said, this is obscene. There's no way this can be true. He writes another Vita di Dante, basically saying, I'm going to contest, a bunch of this stuff. So maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle. But point being, he was being talked about and was being studied, well into. And then, of course, like I said, there'll be moments where he sort of drops off. Certainly in the 16th century, they're not using Dante as a model. They're holding him up as a great ideal, but his poetry is not being used as Petrarch's poetry. That is going to be the way forward. So, yeah.
On the Zoom, on the chat, Zoomers. Sarah's put up a whole lot of links, which take you further into what Alex has been up to. There's a link with the best translations of Dante to read, and then there's 2 links to the previous Dante lectures. So there's lots of information. So I'm going to ask you to remember to put it into what's on Monday, so that people in the room and others can have access to those links as well. Okay. So that gets a communication, and then also out in the Zoom world on the chat, Marion Fish asks, what did the church at the time think of the Commedia?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Because certainly, I didn't get so into it, but as we said, you can imagine where Florentines end up, the majority of them in Inferno, and many clergy actually end up there, and many popes as well end up in Inferno. And so it's a great question of what did the church think? Italy, and I'm using Italy before it was Italy, but this idea of Italy is and was very anti-clerical, and so they didn't, they weren't shocked, let's put it that way, by a lot of what Dante was saying. I mean, Boccaccio is going to do much worse in the Decameron. Well, much worse. Dante goes pretty heavy on some of the popes. But interestingly, it depends on the pope, because he had some great things to say about certain people. In the 18th century, I don't remember which pope. I think it was a Pius, only because they were all Piuses at a certain point. But one of the Piuses, actually in the 18th century, declared Paradiso, the book, the Cantica of Paradiso, doctrine. So saying this is dogma. You can take this and you can use it. And in fact, Teodolinda Barolini, who's an amazing Dante scholar at Columbia University in the United States, she wrote this incredible letter where she is kind of open letter to students here in Italy. And she said, the worst thing that they ever did was for the church to say this is like dogma, because that's going to put everybody off of reading it. Nobody's going to want to read it at this point. She said, and she's always talking about what a revolutionist poem is. And so, it depends on the time period, essentially, of what the church thought about it. But again, being the comedy itself is a deeply Christian text, deeply Christian. The popes that he condemns, or the clergy that he condemns, are people that he says are going against the message of Christ. They're going against the message of the church itself. And so it is it's a deeply, deeply Christian work, very much a work of its time, of medieval Christianity. But, different moments, certainly different ideas.
Sarah has been busy on the chat, so Zoomers, look at the chat, because that's Sarah's weekly reminder to make your contribution. We do need everyone to put in whatever they feel comfortable with, so that we can keep this series going. Thank you for that. More thoughts or questions in the room? Everyone's gone very quiet. You've been so comprehensive. Here we are. Here's a couple.
Okay.
Since the printing press didn't come out till the 1400s, how was the work published?
Very good question. So not until the 1450s, and we certainly saw editions of it flying off the presses at that point. But it would be circulated in manuscript form, but it was read aloud. I mean, this is so important. So I thank you for this question, because I didn't talk about this. Poetry like this and stories, they were recited. They were told. So it's not performed per se, but it is recited. And so I love thinking about Boccaccio, for example, right? So he in the 1370s would have been reading this. And I use him just as an example, but this would have been anywhere. If we're in a room like this, and when you read the comedy, as I said, it's filled with people who are contemporaries, people who are just, but were very well known, so you can only imagine in the room as, elbowing each other, like, I can't believe he said that about him, or remember that story. So it was very much a shared experience. We now use these texts in a very academic, scholarly, we sit there and we highlight and we read and we're solitary. No, they would have been circulated in manuscript form, and they would have been recited. They would have been read aloud, whether it be in the Palazzo Bologna or in a more public lecture area. But yeah.
Hi. I wanted to ask you a question. You mentioned the empty tomb outside of Santa Croce, and I wonder if you could talk a bit about
that. So he dies in Ravenna in 1321. And immediately, can you imagine, the Florentines are like, well, yeah, we'll take him back. Well, he's ours. And Ravenna said, no, absolutely not. And so, this went on for years and years and years. And still to this day, in 2007, the city council of Florence came together. They had a special session, and they reinstated his citizenship. Imagine how thrilled. But his body is in Ravenna. It's absolutely, as it should always stay there, in my opinion. But in the 18th century, so when Santa Croce, right at this moment of pre-unification, unification, they're looking for symbols. Who can we, who are going to be our people here, Italians that we can. And Santa Croce started to take on, the pantheon of the Italian glories. And so they built a monument. There are lots of monuments. There's a monument to Leonardo da Vinci. It's just a plaque. It's not exciting. But there are monuments that are there that are not actually tombs. His looks terrifyingly like a tomb. I mean, and it's sandwiched in between, Machiavelli, Alfieri, who are actually there, somewhere around, Michelangelo, this sort of thing. And so the idea was to do something that was going to honor him, but it's very much kind of waiting for him. Every single year, I will tell you this, the city council writes to Ravenna, can't make it up, and says, can we? Is it this year? And every year they say no, and every year Florence sends the olive oil that lights the eternal flame at Dante's tomb. So he is always accompanied by Florence. They do a whole ceremony when they do it, so it's quite lovely. But I'll tell you something super tacky. In 2021, when it was the 700th anniversary of his death, Florence wrote and said, Leonardo's going to hate this. Florence wrote and said, can we have his head? Can we have his skull and have it on display? Wow. And Ravenna was like, again, no. And then COVID happened. And so, but can you imagine? Oh, several times. Yeah, those poor bones. I mean, yeah. Right. Well, that's why they got Michelangelo back, is because they knew what had happened with Dante. They didn't want that again, and so they sort of got permission on Michelangelo. Yeah, you can't have him when he's dead. It's just the mind thing. I think it does make sense.
In a moment, we'll come to you, Matt. There's a few things on the chat. Lots of fan mail. Superb lecture. Thank you, Alex. Great lecture. But there's a couple of questions in there as well. Anuti Galad says, can you elaborate a little bit about Botticelli's illustrations? And Brenda Moore-McCann asks about why Florence wasn't on the Via Francigena. So those two questions.
Okay. So Anuti, elaborate about Botticelli's illustration. So he was commissioned by Cristoforo Landino, who's a Florentine humanist, to illustrate an edition of the Commedia. And so the map of hell is part of that. So that's what I had pulled out here. But there are several illustrations. That manuscript is held, if I'm not mistaken, in Berlin. I don't know. I think it's Berlin. And the map of hell is at the Vatican. So it's in the Vatican archives, and they have given permission. I think it's the University of Texas, if I'm not mistaken, They have a site that's called Dante's World, and they are the only ones, apparently, and now it's 2024, so who knows, but that they're the only ones who have permission to house the digital, the high resolution image of the map of hell. So it's available for everyone. So you can go and see it, the map of hell that I showed, but the manuscript is in Berlin. Yeah. And then why is Florence not on the Francigena? I mean, I don't know, but it's not. I mean, I don't know what the planning process was. It's a great question, but like I said, I mean, probably because, you know, I mean, if you're thinking about kind of quickest way to Rome, because it's coming from France, and so, but also, let's be honest, you know, it goes to Lucca, it goes through Alto Pascio, it goes through places that had money at the time, that were actually booming. In the 11th century in Florence, Fiorenza, there was nothing happening. So, you know, it probably was, I'm sure Franco Cardini has a much better answer, but I would imagine it's just because there wasn't much happening here. And so, you know, it made more sense. They were probably lobbying, you know, places like Alto Pascio. I mean, who in the world? They were a big bread center, by the way.
So, yes, I'm just astounded at how many facts that you have at your fingertips and how much information there is. It's really great.
Yeah.
But is this one of the first self-help books that was ever written?
Teodoro. Yeah. You know, I'm a big fan of the self-help book. And in fact, Martha Beck, who is Oprah Winfrey's life coach, because yes, my girl has a life coach, and she's called Martha Beck. She wrote a book. I have not read it, but it's a self-help book, and it uses the comedy as a way of, so for sure. I mean, when I said the only way out is through, I mean, how much do we wish that weren't true? But like, the sooner you learn that, you're going to help yourself a whole lot more, right? If you know, but it absolutely is. I mean, the reality is this, is that Dante going down into the depths of hell, and when he goes down and he sees Lucifer, right, and he's face to face with Satan, Dante dies to himself. He becomes a different self, right? So that self that then makes its way up the mountain of purgatory is not the Dante that has come through, right, this process. And so, you know, maybe self-help, a little bit of yeah, well, you would know. We should do that. Let's do a psychotherapy reading of the comic. Will you loan him to me, Gail, so we can do that? Okay, let's do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think if we can, we should wrap up, because it's gone on quite late and people have dinner to go to, like Carla. And so just to wrap up, we need to do our thank yous. So first of all, thanks again to Gail and Mac for sponsoring tonight.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
The next thank you is to our wine partners this season from Basilica Carpaccio near Panzano, and we're going to drink some beautiful red wine out there in a moment. Quick commercial, we're taking a bus down to Carpaccio on the 28th of March. There's a couple of seats left. You get to visit the beautiful winery, have a wine tour, do some wine tasting, then we all go on to lunch at Cantinetta Vignana, which is a really nice restaurant nearby. And it's very nicely priced. There's a couple of seats up in the bus. Don't miss out. Last commercial of the evening. And then last but not least, thanks, Alex.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Served.